I looked out the tent flap and saw this wall of water, rocks, trees, and whatever, because it was a beautiful moonlight night. After that, you couldn't see anything because of the dust. I yelled at Ray, I said, let's get out of here. And he reached over and grabbed Steve, and all he saw of Steve was just an arm and a head because that part of the tent had collapsed. And we got outside the tent and drew a blank there for a while. The next thing I remember was we had Steve in the front seat of the station wagon, and Ray was trying to move it, and it wouldn't move. And he turned the lights on in the station wagon, and then people started coming. Don't leave, don't leave. The painter girl came running. She said, my mother's lost her arm. Don't leave us. There were mangled arms and legs and internal injuries. I don't know if I should say actually who it was. I could have literally laid my forearm down on the bone on her thigh. So you know the injuries were severe.
There was a spot I had been told about while on a drive to the hospital to stitch up a sliced pinky finger. I was new to Montana, a Florida boy thirsty for adventure and hoping to experience a world that wasn't so void of changes in elevation. 2 days into my new adventurer lifestyle, and I had already managed to sever my little finger on a rusty water heater. As we wove our way through the rocky troughs to a little clinic in Ennis, Montana, we passed by a unique patch of mountains where an event had occurred years before my time. Now fast forward 3 years. I was once again living and working back in that same town. After work, I'd often take a quick shower and then warm up the car. I'd grab a coffee from the local bookstore and a boxed up Boston cream gas station pastry, the kind so sweet that they have a knack for scouting out those hidden cavities. There were still a few hours of light left in the day, and I wanted to spend them alone. For the most part, I'm an introvert. I live for those moments where I can exist solely with my own thoughts. And I knew of a perfect place. That broken mountain that I had been told about years ago. I'm Cody Creech, and welcome to Quiet Town, a weekly audible road trip to lost history and local lore. This week, I welcome you to West Yellowstone, Montana. A few moments ago, you heard from Mildred Green. She likes to go by Tootie. Tootie was one of those there the night that the mountain broke, and her account of the event has been etched in her memory for nearly 60 years. We will return to Tootie's account shortly, but first, let's go back. 11:39 p.m., August 17th, 1959. 27 miles outside of the gates of America's first national park, campers of the Cliff Lake Campground and Rock Creek Campground slept with their families under the stars as crickets chirped. The sound of the Madison River carving its path through the mountainous Montana landscape pervade a cloudy night. Residential cabins, perched along the slope sides of the hills and the riverbanks, were dark and motionless as the groups inside had retired for the evening. And although the residents slept peacefully, the encompassing geological world around them was anything but slumbering. For the rocky terrain that had been sleeplessly shaped over millions of years of collision and erosion would find itself vulnerable to just 30 seconds of destruction. 30 seconds that would forever label that evening as the Night of Terror. A deep growl seeped from the earth, drowning out the songs of the crickets and the vocal cascading waters. The ground began to shake violently. Surely woken from their slumbers, residents and campers along the Madison River rapidly tried to make sense of the situation. You see, a fault line had reached its threshold, and finally giving way to a 30, maybe 40-second convulsion. An earthquake registering at 7.5 on the Richter scale. The nearby and unsuspecting occupants were now in the midst of an unforgiving and merciless act of nature, one with the power to move mountains and bend rivers.
One of America's worst series of earthquakes in this century, felt throughout the Northwest, centers its force on southwestern Montana. In Medicine River Canyon, 50 million tons of earth and rock, the top of an 8,000-foot mountain, thundered across a forest campground in one of the biggest landslides. Helicopters rescued 300 campers who were trapped between the Titanic slide and Hebgen Dam, 7 miles upstream. 60 are known injured, mostly vacationers, with at least a dozen fatalities. The grim search for victims or survivors continues throughout the area as evacuation of those who did escape proceeds. Many residents of the area just west of Yellowstone Park are evacuating too. The threat of another major quake is frighteningly real.
On an unnamed mountain, 80 million tons of rock and debris slid down onto terrified and helpless campers. Toward the valley near the undeveloped western section of Cliff Lake Campground, Martin Stryker, a 15-year-old boy, and his 2 younger brothers, John, 13, and Morgan, 8, slept in a tent about 10 feet away from their father and stepmother. Like most, the shifting earth woke them. The boys heard a large crash, and Martin assured his brothers that it was probably just thunder. Nonetheless, Martin unzipped the tent flap and peered outside. But it wasn't thunder. Instead, it was a splintered pine tree lying across their now mangled car. Their dog, that had been housed in the vehicle for the night, was gone. Surprised that his dad wasn't reacting to the commotion, Martin scanned to his parents' tent. And there he saw the canvas, flattened, swallowed by a monstrous boulder. Martin circled the tent alone. He concluded that there was no way that his parents had survived. He coldly returned to his tent and began getting dressed. He directed his brothers to do the same. In time, Martin told them that their parents were dead. And although the boys cried, Martin remained remarkably calm and deliberate, probably realizing that the responsibility of taking care of his brothers were now resting solely on his shoulders. They walked to Wade Lake, where he knew people would be staying in cabins. Finding a family willing to take his brothers to the nearby Virginia city, Martin left them and returned to the scene to wait and help rescuers recover his parents' bodies. Aside from crushing many visitors immediately, the sudden burst of shifting rock caused hurricane-like winds, shredding nearby trailers and buildings and leaving tattered remains of twisted metal and wood. The Hebgen Dam, just east of the area, cracked in 4 places, unleashing a powerful wall of water to pulse through the valley below, washing out anything before it. Trees were stripped of their green or uprooted completely. Homes not elevated high enough above the riverbanks were consumed by vicious waves. The water creeping through every log and crevice as the roof lines only appeared above the frothing current. The Greens, a family from Billings, decided to take an extended vacation near the end of August, opposed to their typical June visit. And although their usual go-to, Rock Creek Campground, had no vacancies, they made do with a rough patch of land just above the campground. And here, we meet back up with Tootie, a trained nurse whose skills would prove vital to many who survived that night. Tootie recalled the day leading up to the tragedy as exceptionally windy, leaving them on shore and off their boat due to the rough conditions. But by night, the wind had succumbed to an eerie quiet. Even a chipmunk that had been eager to approach the family for food had now become reserved and cautious, perhaps a disturbing foreshadowing of the events ahead, as if nature had been able to forecast that night. Tootie's son, Steve, had an upset stomach and was allowed to sleep with his parents for the evening, a decision that would ultimately save his life. When the event started, Tootie remembers how powerful the roar was, so loud and consuming, like a train barreling down on their tent. By the time they reacted to the commotion, a wall of water and debris was already upon them.
I looked out the tent flap and saw this wall of water, rocks, trees, and whatever, because it was a beautiful moonlight night. After that, you couldn't see anything because of the dust. I yelled at Ray, I said, let's get out of here. And he reached over and grabbed Steve, and all he saw of Steve was just an arm and a head because that part of the tent had collapsed. And we got outside the tent and drew a blank there for a while. The next thing I remember was we had Steve in the front seat of the station wagon, and Ray was trying to move it, and it wouldn't move. And he turned the lights on in the station wagon, and then people started coming. Don't leave, don't leave. The painter girl came running. She said, my mother's lost her arm. Don't leave us.
When they got to the little girl's mother, they found Myrtle Painter with her arm severed off and her chest severely injured. Tootsie made a tourniquet to stop Myrtle's excessive bleeding, and in the dark distance, calls of help came from dozens of others. The Greens would come across many others in peril, like a couple in their 70s who had escaped rushing water by finding refuge on their rooftop, until the climbing waters soon consumed that as well, forcing them to scale a nearby tree.
Actually, by the time it started getting light, I got two more patients. They were the malts that had climbed the tree all night long. As the water kept coming up, they kept going higher up in the tree. And they came, and they were, of course, chilled to the bone, because after all, they were in their early 70s and had spent the night in this cold air and cold water. So we brought them in, put them in the front seat of a car, and stuffed them in sleeping bags. And I can remember offering her a drink of whiskey. Somebody had a bottle of whiskey there. I offered it to him, and he turned it down. He was a minister. He wasn't going to drink that whiskey. But she took it. But later she wrote and told me that she left it on the floor all over the helicopter.
They would also find Verona Holmes, who actually was helped by the rising water level when a fallen tree that had trapped her was lifted enough to allow her to shimmy free. Tootsie recalls the Holmes family as being the most severe injury she would see that night. Verona would suffer from leg issues for the rest of her life, and unfortunately, her 72-year-old mother that had sustained severe injuries would not survive the ordeal. Those trying to escape the area soon found themselves trapped. The connecting roads had been torn and swallowed by the shifting earth. Bits of ribbon road now lay in shards of compromised concrete under climbing waters and mountains of debris. This obviously made the rescue conditions more difficult. In an already rural area where nearby health facilities were nearly hours away, the first responders also had to battle broken transportation systems, making it hard to find victims and even communicate with other responders.
About 9:30, the smoke jumpers came in. And the smoke jumpers had to make 3 passes over the area they wanted to drop into because there were so many sightseeing planes in the way. And they said that the last pass they made, they were going to ram somebody if they didn't get out of the way.
This episode of Quiet Town is brought to you by Port Medley Trading Company. Port Medley Trading Company is revolutionizing what clothing can be. We all like our clever pop culture wear with tongue-in-cheek jokes, but sometimes they're a little too in your face. Port Medley Trading Company integrates subtle jokes seamlessly into cleverly designed shirts, making them practical to wear out, yet still interlaced with your personality. See, they believe shirts can be more than just an article of clothing. They can be a story. Everyone loves getting packages in the mail, but with Port Medley, your package becomes an experience. Every item is hand-packaged uniquely, so that no 2 items are delivered the same. Use the code QT to get 10% off your next order. That is the letter Q and T. Put those together and save some money. Port Medley Trading Company, for those who chose adventure. It is fairly well known that Yellowstone is more than just a few pools of hot water designated a national park. Yellowstone is what they call a supervolcano. The term sounds like something out of a 1970s Godzilla flick, but in truth, It's a literal hotbed for geological and thermal activity. Spanning a massive 34 by 45 miles, the Yellowstone caldera is far from dormant, experiencing 1,000 to 2,000 earthquakes annually. Although most of these earthquakes are relatively weak, as recently as 2014, the area has experienced a 4.8 earthquake that was the largest for them since 1980. And even in 2017, there was significant seismic activity in western Montana as well as the bordering Idaho. Although not directly connected to the caldera, the threat of nearby activity is still something to keep an eye on. Experts have determined that it's not if, but when, Yellowstone will erupt again. And when it does, the effects will reach much further than the immediate 45-mile radius. Clouds of ash and soot have the potential to be carried thousands of miles away, creating a sort of trickle-down destruction. The suspended dust will likely block out the sun, hindering temperatures, crop growth, and will completely reface entire environments. The loss of crops could lead to massive drops in food production and in turn would lead to an epidemic of starvation. Of course, if you are within a closer proximity, you will not have to worry about this trickle-down. You will have a prime view of an active volcano, but it will also be the last view you ever have. Today, the site of the earthquake remains fairly quiet. A visitor center has been built to educate people of the disaster that took place nearly 60 years before. Diagrams and videos speak on the science of earthquakes and the huge geological hotbed that the entire region rests on. A large monument boulder is placed within the trail, and embedded within is a plaque with all 29 victims' names. And although the area holds a place among the largest and deadliest earthquakes in U.S. history, the visitor center is typically free from crowds, even in the 2 summers I spent there myself. Those evenings after work, I would often find myself being drawn to the visitor center and lookout points. Along the 30-minute drive, I'd pass by the healthy Hebgen Lake and the evergreens that skirted the banks. I'd follow the Madison River's crooked path past the dam and past the sporadic homes and campgrounds. As you come closer to the visitor center, the road is peppered with signs that point to significant locations of that night. Many signs remind guests that this is, quote, a geological area. One of those signs even reads, "The Night of Terror." Once you reach Earthquake Lake, there is a significant change in mood and feel. The water seems colder, an icy blue. There's a lack of movement, a flat stained glass. Spire-like trees pierce the water surface and extend skyward, vacant of the branches and leaves that once decorated their trunks. And at the highest lookout point, gusts can nearly blow you over. Down to your left, you see Earthquake Lake, a Listerine-like pool of water that was non-existent only 60 years before. To your right, a vast flatland where the Madison River winds its way to the horizon, every night kissing the sun goodnight. And directly ahead, a chunk of mountain, displaced. Warm red rock looks like a smooth scar permanently defacing the mountain. Within this rock, 19 people are still entombed. Their eternal resting spot. A forever that makes the millions of years that shaped the mountainside seem like a blink of an eye. I would often park my car at the lip of the overlook. I would be alone. Just me and the mountain. No different than the soul 60 years before me that never left. And I would stay until the light died, and the mountain was a mystery.
Good morning. It's finally nice to see you.
This episode of Quiet Town is written and produced by me, Cody Creech. But the stories don't have to stop here. By subscribing to Quiet Town on Patreon, you'll be able to access exclusive content as well as gain access to episodes early. There you will be able to see pictures of Quake Lake, see the destruction, the overlook today, and even a Facebook Live video I made on a whim last August. And then, go see it yourself. Pictures are nice, but experiences are better. Find me on Facebook and Instagram at Quiet Town Podcast, and visit our website, quiettownpodcast.com. Join the Bulletin, our weekly newsletter. And don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes. Ratings are a huge factor for making or breaking the success of a show. We live and die by the stars. All 5-star reviews will be entered into a drawing for a $50 gas card. I want to help you travel and see these places as well. Message me. I want to hear from you. Tell me your favorite Quiet Town story, and one day, it may just become an episode itself. I love listening and learning, just like you. So, tell me a story. And thank you for listening. I'll be back next Monday with a brand new episode. And until then, I'll just leave you with a clip from the next one. Temperatures plunged to 40 below, and the crew turned gunny sacks into layered clothing. And when the provisions could not make it to them, they lived off of dried peaches. And here arrives our hero. Not a knight in shining armor mounted on his steed. Instead, it's the steed himself.